You're listening to the Washington State Real Estate Investing Podcast. This episode brought to you by the Easy Home Buyer, serving the Spokane and Coeur d'Alene area. If you're an investor in the greater Spokane area looking to connect with wholesalers, look no further than the Easy Home Buyer. Click on the link in the show notes to be put on their buyer list today. And by FlexiSpot, the maker of ergonomic furniture. If you're looking for a new desk, look no further than the E7 standing desk. With a weight limit of 350 pounds and adjustable height from 24 inches to 53 inches, it's the perfect desk for the home office. Save $20 now with an offer code WSE720 at checkout. Welcome back to another episode of the Washington State Real Estate Investing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Udick. In today's episode, I chat with Marisa Ala, an attorney that focuses on landlording and estate planning. This episode really focuses on being prepared. And being a landlord is all about being prepared, which brings me to this week's Investor's Highlight. Make sure you calendar out some of the most easily forgotten tasks, like reviewing your insurance you have on properties. My wife and I, a few weeks ago, had our annual meeting with our insurance broker, where we went through all of our properties, making sure we were comfortable with the coverage we had, and making sure the updates we did over this summer were reflected. For example, turning a duplex that were both 2-bed, 1-bath into 4-bed, 2-bath units. Doing an annual update with your insurance broker is a great way to make sure you're planning ahead rather than waiting for something to happen. The one pro tip here, for us at least, is any of your buildings that were built before 1980, we make sure that we have sewer backup protection on. For example, the 1908 and the 1917 house we own are no-brainers, but the 1979 duplex we have has had issues already. So we want to make sure we've covered for things we know are an issue with that age home. That takes me back to episode 14 with Kira from Home Pride Inspect, where she talks about knowing the age of the home and what issues that age of home has is important to know. And then make sure you have adequate insurance to cover those known issues. So, if you don't have it on your calendar yet, do it right now. Send an email to your insurance broker and book a time to meet over the phone to review your insurance policy. It's 30 minutes that potentially could save you thousands. And that brings me to today's guest, Marisa Ala, who is an attorney who focuses on landlord law and estate planning. Enjoy these nuggets from a real estate-focused attorney. And with that, on with the show. All right, welcome back to the Washington State Real Estate Investing Podcast. I'm so excited to have Marisa on our show today. Marisa is an attorney. It's always great when we can get attorneys on the show to talk and answer some of our questions as real estate investors and those that invest in real estate. And I'm excited to have her on both to have a conversation today, but also introduce her to the rest of the listeners out there who might also need to reach out to an attorney at some point. And we're going to get into that today. So Marisa, welcome to the podcast. Let's get started by talking a little bit about your journey into becoming an attorney who specializes in estate planning and supporting those in the real estate investing business.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show or on the podcast. I appreciate the opportunity. So my name is Marisa Ala, and I have been an attorney for 25 years now, I think, which is crazy. I can't believe it's been that long. But right out of law school, I ended up working for a firm that did construction litigation. So I have been involved in construction litigation for all 25 years, representing builders and developers of all kinds of residential homes, multifamily, condominiums, single-family homes, you name it. So that's where I gathered most of my experience. And then I'd say about almost a little over 5 years ago, I decided to leave the firm that I was with for 18 years and start my own practice. And in that transition, I started working more with just individuals, doing estate planning. I handle probate matters. I do some real estate work, some business work, you name it. I've kind of done a lot of different things, more for individuals as opposed to big corporations.
Awesome. That's great. Well, let's dig into it here a little bit and talk about. Let's get started with the thing that's probably on everybody's mind, and that is tenant landlord laws, especially here in the state of Washington. There's been a lot of changes over the last few years coming out of COVID, and as we're recording this, actually, just news broke that all of these laws that were put in place during COVID are going to expire. But as we kind of talk about this here in the state of Washington, what trends are you seeing? And maybe if you have like 3 things that landlords need to be aware of right now, what might be some of the top things that you're hearing about out there?
I think one thing that landlords need to know, and already know, I'm sure, is that Washington state just isn't the most landlord friendly state. Most of the laws are, they favor tenants, and of course, try to ensure that tenants aren't evicted without cause, that landlords can't hold on to tenants' property, and so forth. So, I hope that starts to make a change. But at least since COVID, landlords weren't really able to evict anyone for a really long time. And so now that has opened back up, landlords are now in a place where they can finally get rid of tenants that haven't been paying for a long time. I think one thing that I've gotten the most questions about is just, what is good cause to remove a tenant? And obviously non-payment is one of them, but you also can look at things like criminal activity or even just violations of the lease. But depending upon the circumstance that you have, there's a different notice requirement as far as how long you have to be able to kick someone out of the property, how much notice you have to provide. So that's one really tricky area, is just getting someone out. And then once you get them out, how do you get the money? So those landlords out there that didn't get paid for a really long time, just because you're doing an eviction doesn't mean that all of a sudden you don't have a right to collect the money that was owed to you. You can still file, a breach of lease agreement. You can try to get the rent payment back. So there's a lot of actions that can be taken. I think another area that I often get questions about from a landlord perspective is just making sure that you have your lease agreement in place. I think too many people just rent out and they don't use a property management company or anything like that. And so they just don't have a solid lease agreement in place. And that's really, really critical to ensuring that you have all the rights as a landlord and you have your, all your ducks in a row.
Can you talk a little bit about these different dates? Like, do you, because I that's one thing that constantly we're talking with our property manager about is, oh, well, you have to give 60 days notice for that, and you have to give 30 days notice for this. And that is where I think working with a lawyer can also help you to understand what those rules and laws about giving notice around different aspects of eviction, or even just upping a lease or renewing a lease at this point.
Exactly. And I think that, again, those are the questions that I really get the most. And so I think the most common is obviously the tenant doesn't pay rent, right? That's going to be the most frequent reason for an eviction. And that requires a 14-day notice to pay the rent or leave the premises. We call that quit, a notice to quit. But if the tenant does pay their rent, then there's no longer any authority that allows you to continue with the eviction, right? So they have, first you give them the notice to pay, and then if they don't pay up, then they have to leave. Another common one, I think, in this area, unfortunately, is if the tenant is involved in some kind of criminal activity. That is when you can send a 3-day notice to quit, meaning 3 days, you're out. Obviously, Washington state law is not going to require a landlord to keep a tenant that is participating in some kind of criminal activity. So that is more common, right?
Yeah.
I think another thing that people don't realize is the amount of notice really requires, the amount of notice is based upon how long the lease is. So if you've got, a typical 1-year lease, you have to look at the contents of the lease to say, is it renewable month to month, or does it renew year to year? So that dictates whether or not a certain amount of notice is provided or needs to be provided to a tenant for things like, if they violate the term of the lease, then there's a 10-day notice to comply. So those are some of the most common ones.
Awesome. That's great to know, because I know one of the things that came out of COVID that we've been working on is really no longer allowing a tenant to go month to month, to always have them at least leased up 6 months, if not a year, because of some of the law changes coming out of COVID. It's just harder to get rid of a tenant if you need to when they're on month to month.
Absolutely. I do not like month to month. Yeah, month to month is never a good idea. Always have your tenant sign a lease agreement, whether, like you said, whether it's 6 months or a year. So one of the changes in the law that's coming out is, security deposits and how to obtain a damage or security deposit. And there are going to be some changes in the law on that offers a landlord the option of having a tenant pay a non-refundable fee instead of a security deposit. That's going to be a little bit more favorable to a landlord to be able to keep a non-refundable fee. Because, as it stands, landlords obviously have to account for any money that's spent out of a security deposit.
Right. Well, that'd be nice. I'd like to see that. That'd be
right. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. Let's talk a little bit about real estate and LLCs. I personally, you hear things all over the internet on whether or not you should put your properties in an LLC. What are the benefits of putting it in an LLC? How many properties should you have in an LLC at any given one time? What advice do you give to real estate investors around that idea here in the state of Washington?
So I'm a huge proponent of LLCs. They're really easy to form. And of course, as a lawyer, I'm always going to recommend that you hire a lawyer to do it and don't just try to do it yourself. The reason why you should get an LLC for your real estate is that it isolates your real estate, your business assets, from your personal assets. So when we're investing in real estate, obviously we don't want to risk our primary residence or our personal assets against some kind of judgment that might come in against us. So, for example, if we have a rental property and we have a rental property and the tenant sues for an accident, a slip and fall, something like that. Hopefully you have really good insurance that will cover that lawsuit, but insurance doesn't cover everything. One example that I give to my clients is that I had a large multifamily home builder who was sued by a homeowner for a slip and fall in front of his house. Elderly man, he was already pretty frail, and he slipped on some water in front of the house, and all of a sudden there's a couple of $1 million lawsuit. The insurance company doesn't pay for all of that, even though we think, oh, it's okay, we're insured. The insurance company has all kinds of reasons that they'll put forth, all kinds of exclusions on coverage. They will do everything they can not to pay. So, when you're facing a judgment against you personally, you're going to want to make sure that you are insulated. So that's kind of my biggest reason why I recommend LLCs. They're the best way to protect you from liability.
And do you recommend that
I don't know if you want me to
each
just
property?
go into...
Yeah. Do you recommend that each property be its own LLC, or that can you bundle properties? Is there a plus and a minus, other than if you're sued, the properties only in that LLC are the ones that or could be taken?
Right. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's all about risk tolerance. So I have some clients that prepare an LLC for every property, because what that does is it limits the one property to be available for a judgment, right? So say you have a judgment that's entered for $200,000. That particular plaintiff that was suing you can only collect from the house that's in that LLC. That's it. They can't get any other assets of yours, right? When you bundle, then there's more than one asset. Say you bundle and you have 3 homes in an LLC. Then a potential plaintiff has more funds that they can access in order to satisfy some kind of judgment. So again, it's risk tolerance. It's depending upon how many rental properties you have. I have one client in Colorado who has 9 rental properties. And so he did choose to bundle them into 3 or 4 different LLCs. He did those based on location and also based on whether there was a partner involved in the LLC, right? So you may have some properties that you own, say, by yourself or as a married couple. Now, that's great. You have one LLC for that. But say you own another property that is 50% yours and 50% somebody else's. That should be a separate LLC because it's a multi-member, right? You've got more than one partner involved.
Right. And when you put a property in an LLC, is basically, does the LLC have to be on title? Is that what you have to do? You file a quick claim? Like, for example, my wife and I have a rental property. We are on title as individual people. We just need to quick claim that title to the LLC. Okay.
Exactly. And in Washington and in other states that I work in, depending on the state you're in, there are transfer taxes that may apply. So one thing in Washington is if you are going to put a personal property into an LLC, it just needs to match the same ownership. So for instance, say my husband and I own a rental property and we want to create an LLC for it. That LLC needs to be owned by my husband and I in the same amount, same shares, in order to be exempt from that excise tax, that transfer tax. So that's another reason why it's good to work with a lawyer, because they know the transfer tax laws.
And that's another reason why, if you're in a partnership, an equity partnership with somebody, you want that LLC to be the same equity partnership split as the actual property that you own that you're putting in there. Got it.
As the title, exactly. And then there's no problem with the quitclaim deed. And you're absolutely right. The deed just transfers the property into the name of the LLC. Now, when I'm working with a client who has a trust, a family trust, sometimes there are 2 steps to the transfer. Sometimes we want to have the trust own the property, and then the trust can transfer the property into the LLC. That's more for estate planning purposes. But again, we try to make sure that everything is aligned so that the right person owns the property, not only for risk management, but also for ease of transfer when someone passes away.
Well, let's talk about that. That's a good segue into my last question here, which is, as an investor myself, can you talk about the importance of having a comprehensive estate plan to protect and to pass on investments, whatever might happen? And what do we need to consider, and why is this such an important thing to be putting in place now as an active investor?
Absolutely. I think an estate plan for an active investor is absolutely critical. Really, anyone who has a business of any kind needs to treat it a little differently than someone who is just planning for their family, for instance. So, as a business owner, we have to look at whether or not we have the documents that will say who takes over our business. What happens if I'm gone tomorrow? Is there some kind of access? And who would inherit that property, right? Who's going to inherit the business interests? So there's a lot more planning that goes into it when you do have a business. In particular, as a real estate investor, there's another layer, which is that you want to try to avoid a probate proceeding. Probate is just court involvement, right? So just think of a probate filing as anytime a court has to oversee the transfer of title of a piece of property from the original owner to the beneficiary, right? That's kind of what probate is. And real estate is one of the triggers for a probate proceeding, especially if you own it in your own name. So say I own a piece of property as a real estate investor. It's either my separate property if I'm married, or perhaps I'm a single individual and I own property. That's a big trigger for probate if you don't already have that lined up. So that's one reason to move it into an LLC, for example. And there are a lot of other factors that apply. Another important thing in our area is if you own property in more than one state. So say you have some property in Idaho, you have some property in Washington. That's another thing to be really careful about, because you don't want to have court proceedings in both states. Yeah. So a good estate planner is going to look at all those things. And more often than not, I see myself recommending trusts to real estate investors. It just tends to be the best way to go.
And can you talk about that a little bit? What's the difference of putting things into a trust versus putting them into an LLC? What might some of those benefits be?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not really either or. So we put things in a trust, but we also usually make the trust the owner of the LLC, right? So it doesn't have to be either or. We first put together a trust, and a trust is just like forming a business. I try to say it's a very similar thing. It's a legal entity that you are forming, but you and or your spouse are still the managers of all the assets that are in that trust. And we have to title property to go into the trust. And we also have to title things like bank accounts, and we have to coordinate all your assets to go into this trust. Now, as far as LLCs and real estate investors, like I said, we might be transferring title of the property first into the trust so that the trust owns it. And then if the trust is the owner of the LLC, trust is the member of the LLC, then we move that property from the trust into the LLC. It's kind of like just tracking title and making sure that everything is clean, right? But overall, the benefit is that you've already done all the hard work. And then if something, if and when, I should say, something does happen and we pass away, the only two things that are certain in life, death and taxes, right? Then you've already got it planned out, and everybody knows exactly what's going to happen, not only to your personal assets, but also your business assets.
Oh, that's great. Because I think it's one of those things, especially as an active investor, and I'll just, I do this all the time on the podcast, just talk specifically about my wife and I. Over the last couple of years, we've been so busy, so focused on the investing side of things that we're just now starting to take a step back and being like, okay, well, now what? Now what do we do with all of this? And start putting systems in place and thinking about, those next steps. And, I think your message is a great one. The sooner you start talking about, I think it also becomes easier. I mean, if you're out there with 20 properties and all of a sudden you're saying, oh, now what do I have to do? I mean, that's a lot more paperwork and having getting things organized and, putting the trust in place and getting everything moved around.
Yeah. And we have to consider things like bank accounts and stuff, when you're going back a little bit to the LLCs and how many to have, each LLC should have its own bank account So, you have to talk about, are you using property management companies to manage your properties? How easy is it for you to collect if you have 5 different LLCs, right?
Right.
So it's not 100% about risk avoidance, even though we'd like it to be. There's also just an aspect of management and how easy is it for you to manage separate bank accounts for each property.
Yeah. Yeah, man, so much to think about, right?
Right, it is. And I actually thought of something else when you brought up, families, for instance, that are involved in real estate investment. I know oftentimes at some point, parents want their children to get involved, right? We want to teach our children about investing and about how they can continue this process. So there is something called a family LLC where, I've helped clients that have, either grandparents and their kids or parents and, children that have reached the age of majority that are getting involved in the LLC. And you can start to transfer small shares of the LLC ownership to other members of the family beyond yourself, right? So those family LLCs can be helpful when you're trying to maybe have your kids take over for you in the long run.
Yeah. That's something I hadn't thought about, but yeah, what a great way to be able to do that. You can slowly transfer shares over, therefore transferring over the business.
Right. And I'm not a tax person, but there are tax advantages to doing it that way.
Doing that way as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you for taking some time to chat with us today. I really appreciate it. I mean, we could probably sit here and talk forever, but I don't want to take up more of your time. But if there are investors or contractors that are listening to this and they want to hear more, they want to reach out to you to maybe talk about setting up a trust or LLCs or help structure their business, what's the best way for them to do that?
That would be wonderful. So I would say either telephone or email. My telephone number is 720, which is a Colorado number, but it is my cell. It is 720-545-6994. And feel free to just give me a call, leave a message for me or my answering service.
Okay.
Or my email, which I am always on, is marisa@thealafirm.com. So that's MARISA at thealafirm.com.
Fantastic.
And I'd love to hear from you guys.
Awesome. And we'll make sure that is all in the show notes as well to make it easy for people that want to reach out and get more information or bounce ideas off you and talk about maybe setting up an estate trust, some LLC stuff, or, if you find yourself in a landlord pickle, somebody to reach out and bounce ideas off of. So, Marisa, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.